Before we get started on our discussion of science, philosophy, theology, I think it'd be nice to learn a little bit more about your life's journey, John. I know that you studied at some of the world's greatest higher education places, Cambridge University. You've been a professor at Oxford, and I think it would be safe to assume, I think, that you probably came from a probably privileged, highly educated background and family. Is that right?
No, it's not right. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. And I'm simply delighted to be partnering with the C.S. Lewis Institute for reasons that will become apparent. But my parents were quite humble people in the educational terms. My father was not allowed to go to university because his father insisted that he ran a family business in a country town, employing, I suppose, 30 to 40 people, selling all kinds of household things like carpets and clothing and so on. But he longed to have an education, and in a sense he taught himself. And in another sense, he was living his life through me. My mum, she was a teacher of typewriting and that kind of thing in a middle school. And one of the things she did for all her children was she taught them to touch type before they left home, and that has been very useful. In that sense, they were humble people, but they were very impressive Christians. And two things I'd say about that is my home country is sadly famous for its sectarianism and violence because of historical problems, sociological problems, and the tension is often described as being between Protestants and Catholics. And my father was so convinced that every man and woman, no matter what they believed, was made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value, that he decided he'd express that by employing as equally as he could across the divide. That meant bombs. It meant that my brother nearly lost his life when a glass window blew into his face and took his face essentially right off, and it had to be stitched back on. And that impressed me and left me with that sense that as I go out into life, I need to fix that in my mind. The people that I meet have dignity, no matter where they're from, no matter what they do, no matter what their wealth is of any kind, intellectual, financial, and so on, because they're made in the image of God. That was very important and still is to me today. The second thing is, they loved me enough to give me space to think. And that was rare, because in a small country, often the expressions of Christianity become ghetto-like, rigid, legalistic. And my parents weren't like that. And I think so often that many of my contemporaries, the moment they got away from home, their Christianity disappeared overnight because it was never real, it was never personal, it was never theirs. But because they'd allowed me this space and encouraged me to think and ask questions and read other worldviews. Now you think of a father like that who gives his son at the age of 13 a copy of the Communist Manifesto. And I said, "What's that, Dad?" And he says, "The Communist Manifesto. Have you read it?" "No." "Why should I read it?" "Because you need to know what other people think." And it was that kind of instruction that really began my intellectual development very early. And then he discovered C.S. Lewis. And he responded to Lewis's books, Mere Christianity in particular. He used to keep 20 of them in the glove compartment in his car, because in those days it was quite safe to pick up hitchhikers. And many a hitchhiker left happy with a copy of Mere Christianity. But Dad was bright enough, apart from the education that he hadn't had, to realize this was gold dust. So he shared it with me, and I devoured it because I discovered an intellectual guide. But more than that, because my background was Christian, and impressively Christian, I still have no idea what it's like to be an adult and an atheist or agnostic. And Lewis became for me a mentor, showing me the inside of his intellectual life, what it actually feels like to be an atheist. And therefore he has accompanied me, so to speak, up to this day. And of course it didn't hurt that he came from Northern Ireland as well.
Well, obviously, later in your professional career, went into mathematics and science. When is it, as a child or adolescent, or did you discover that math and science were something you enjoyed? I mean, there's some budding scientists in the room. How did that process come about that you got interested in those subjects?
I think these things often have a great deal to do with teachers. And I had a primary teacher, and I used to ask her, because I found arithmetic astonishingly easy. So I said, "Please, miss, give me some more homework." And I was the only child ever to have done that. And because of that, she took a bit of an interest in me. And that stayed, although I wobbled all over the place, because once I discovered foreign languages, I was gripped by grammar. Now that may not rejoice your hearts very much, but you see, there's a logic to it all. Mathematics is a language, pure mathematics, and it's the most, well, not perhaps quite the most compressed language we've got, because there are all kinds of computer languages and so on, but it's highly compressed and highly precise. Natural languages, some of them are much more structured than others, and Latin was the one I got to first. And because I studied its grammar and loved its grammar, I learned how English worked, because we don't have such a structured grammar. And here it was that I began to read C.S. Lewis's books on the English language. And they have been of crucial importance in my intellectual development and in my work in explaining the Christian faith. Just understanding how your own language works. And I discovered pretty young that if you got to know some foreign languages, they added a richness to your understanding of your own language. So at family prayers, I used to translate from a French Bible. And if I did it too slowly, my siblings got irritated. And so that was the way, and it's the way I've used with other languages. I always say to people, if you've got any notion of a foreign language, get a Bible in that language. And to hold a Bible in a foreign language for a kid can be a very exciting thing. Mum, I understand some of this stuff that's written in French or German or Italian or Spanish or whatever. And those were formative things. So I discovered languages, and I had a brilliant languages teacher. He was a little bit brutal because he'd been an interrogator after the war. But he was so committed. I never knew a teacher like this, that say a pupil, and this happened in my time, one of the pupils said, "Sir, I'd like to learn Russian." "Okay," he said, "give me a couple of weeks and I'll get ahead of you and I'll teach it to you." Absolutely amazing. I didn't enroll because I wasn't in the right class, but I learned Russian later. That's a different story. So that was terrific. And then I became a ham radio operator. It's something a lot of people have never heard of these days, but I became a ham radio operator because my father didn't want a television. And this is what he was like, and I can so remember this. I'd seen TV, not many homes had them, and of course we went to the neighbors to watch the TV. And Dad said to me, "Look," he said, you're not going to be pleased with this, but I don't like this unrestricted viewing by neighbors. We'd rather control it. But at the moment, I have a conscience about having a television in the house. This was a long time ago, you know. He later got one. I mean, he was very just in his thinking. And he said, because I think it may interfere with your intellectual development, I'm not going to get one. But, he said, as a compensation, is there anything of similar character that might interest you? And I said, well, Dad, I'm disappointed, but I accept your argument. I would like a sophisticated shortwave radio. And he took a day off work, which wasn't easy to do, and drove down to the capital city, and we went to a ship's chandler's, and he found this lovely radio set, the cheapest in the Eddystone range. I still have it, and it worked for 60 years with tubes in it. And of course, I immediately heard private individuals talking the shortwave. And my curiosity, I was 12, 13, was such that I found out that they were amateur radio operators. So I said, how do I become one? And I set the exam and built a transmitter. And soon I was on the airwaves, and this was spectacular. We didn't have the money to travel. Foreign travel was very rare. But I could travel on the radio. I could speak French to people in Martinique or France or Switzerland. And so I decided at school, why don't I do a test? We had our O-level exams, you know, did 5 or 6 years study and you did the exam. And I thought, I wonder could I do it in less than a year without any classes in school, but simply talking it on the radio. So German was the language I picked to do that, and I achieved my O-level in 6 months. And that was, I didn't know it, but my father's restraint became a huge part of my ministry, in the sense that for a large part of my life, my teaching and preaching was in German and not in English. And so those little things add up to important things. Then, because I got interested in radio, I thought, I know what I want to be, an electronics engineer. So I applied and got a scholarship for Queen's University, Belfast. And it was a very good scholarship. And the headmaster came to me one day and he said, Lennox, would you be interested in going to Cambridge? He'd been there in about 1830 or something. But he said, we don't have people that can teach you physics and chemistry to that level, but I can teach you mathematics. So I consulted a person who became a mentor and lifelong friend and guide to Bible teaching and also things intellectual. And he said to my father, if you can give him the chance, do. And that was the big change in my life. And I got a scholarship to go to Emmanuel College, Cambridge, from where, by the way, John Harvard came. And I've often been in the Harvard room with the Harvard scholars. We've won every year. So that's how.
Fascinating, wonderful. Well, so you then left Northern Ireland to the University of Cambridge. I imagine that was a different world to enter. What are some of the highlights of your university years and leaving Northern Ireland and to go to the big world of Cambridge?
Well, it was a big world, but it was an interesting world. And I discovered, of course I didn't know, that I was well prepared for it. Because having read Lewis and many other books, and some fairly heavy books like Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy and all this kind of thing, I had a friend who was 2 or 3 years older and already at university. And our idea of a holiday was to try to borrow a small car and fill the trunk of it with books and then go and read them and discuss them. So I was in a way remarkably prepared for university. And I decided from day one, if Christianity is true, I am not going to hide my light. And that proved very interesting because there was a Christian group that made a presentation in the first week. And I felt their logic was a bit faulty, so I challenged it publicly. And there were quite a few atheists and agnostics came, and they rather liked me for doing that. So I immediately I hit the ground running, so to speak. And in one sense, I've been running ever since. And very rapidly decided that what I hadn't gained at home was any real personal knowledge of what makes people atheists, agnostics, other religions. So what I decided to do was to search out people who did not share my Christian worldview and befriend them. And I've been doing that for nearly, 55 or 56 years. And I've proved that it is really the key to get to know people. And I do it like Socrates did, my great intellectual hero, by asking people questions and listening to what they say. Because you never know what's going on in our culture unless you listen. Some of us, especially from Ireland, are great talkers. But somebody once taught me I got one mouth and two ears, and to use them in that proportion might be wise.
And while you were at Cambridge, I understand you actually got to hear C.S. Lewis speak, is that right?
I did indeed. I went there in 1962, and we started, of course, in October, and it was very cold. And I discovered very quickly, I didn't know Lewis was seriously ill, but he had volunteered a series of 8 lectures in the Christmas term in 1962. And I discovered that he gave the lectures just across the road from the Mathematics Institute. And so I would sneak out from time to time and went to hear Lewis. And that was such a memory, you know. Would you like to hear what it was like to listen to Lewis? You would? Well, it was cold, and Lewis was a big chap, even bigger than me. And he would burst through the double doors, and he'd start lecturing the moment he came in the door. And he had a hat on and a scarf on and a coat on, and the place was packed, of course, because he was a legend at that time. And he would wend his way around through the students and gradually divest himself of his outer garments. And by the time he got to the lectern, you'd had 5 minutes of a brilliant lecture. And he lectured scintillating stuff. What I heard were his final lectures on the John Donne, the English poet. And he'd come to the end, 54 minutes or something, and then he'd reverse the process. So he didn't stop lecturing. He put on his hat, he kept lecturing, he wound up the scarf, he put on his heavy coat, and the last words were uttered exactly as he burst out through the door. No Q&A.
That's great. Wonderful story. Well, if you were to, you've named some people, but 3 people who most have influenced your life, who would those 3 people be, you think?
You mean people outside Scripture?
Yes.
Well, my parents, clearly. The man that advised me to go to Cambridge is a professor called David Gooding. And his books are not known as they should be, but they're brilliant, and you can actually download them for free on a website called Myrtlefield House. And if you're a pastor or teacher in a church, they are goldmine stuff. Because he, like Lewis, understood how literature works, and he applied his knowledge of literature, Greek and Latin literature, to the study of Scripture. And the result is breathtaking, actually, and that's not an exaggeration. And he's in his 90s now and unfortunately suffering from dementia, but he took me under his wing. And for 1 year of my undergraduate time at Cambridge, he was doing a sabbatical at Tyndale House. And really, I often say to people, I've had a public scientific education and I have a private classical education. And that has meant that I feel equally at home in a way among the sciences or the humanities. And I'm passionate about literature, language and history particularly, but not only those. And those have enriched me enormously, especially foreign literature, but not only. And he taught me really most of what I know about Scripture. and how to handle arguments. It just was a phenomenal resource. And I often say, if I see anything, it's only because a child standing on the shoulders of its parent sees a lot further than the parent. We stand on large shoulders. So he influenced me. And I suppose Lewis would have to be the other person through his writings. But of course I've read thousands of books and there are all kinds of people. But if you want to narrow it down, that's it. I should of course mention my wife. Because she stuck with me for over 50 years. And I met her on my first day at Cambridge. My mentor said, almost in biblical language, it's very funny looking back, he said, my boy, he was very English, my boy, in Cambridge there is a man with 4 daughters. So I turn up at church on Sunday morning and there they were, 4 blonde girls sort of descending from the tallest to the smallest. So I grabbed the tallest. And I couldn't have done anything. Why am I sitting here and she's not here? Because she said, you must do this. And through life, she's been support. You cannot do these things, folks, unless you've got full, unhesitating support of your life's partner. And I'm so thankful that I was given someone who cared for the children and who looked after our home through thick and thin when I was in very dangerous situations behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War era. So I want to pay a very special tribute to Sally.
Well, you've been known, I think, especially in recent years, for your interest in the integration of science and faith. How did that come about, and beginning to think about how faith in Christ and Christianity related to the scientific world?
To do with the brain, actually. It's to do with the fact that our brain is 2 hemispheres. And there's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And they tell us, by and large, that the left hemisphere has to do with analysis, to taking things apart. And the right hemisphere has to do with integration. So your left is, roughly speaking, the natural sciences, and your right is the humanities. And I've always been interested in story. That may be because I'm Irish. We are storytellers. And mathematics, fascinating. But how does it fit into science at large? And where does science fit into the bigger cultural picture, into worldview? And in particular, these days, the important question is science the only way to truth? Which many people believe, and the late Stephen Hawking pushed that very hard. And so integrating the picture as well as analyzing in my mathematics, I was trying to jostle both. And I'd been doing that all my life. And of course, that is what led me to the relationship of science to Christianity. I'll not say to faith, because I'd have to ask you what you meant by faith. If you mean faith in God, that's fine. But if you mean faith as a subjective response, then science involves faith at its very foundations. And that's one of the great confusions in modern society. They think here's faith, and that's religion, and it's like fairy stories. And over here there's science. And they do not realize that science is faith-based. You cannot be a scientist without believing that science can be done. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Without believing it can be done. To make that more precise, you cannot be a scientist without believing that the universe is rationally intelligible. To make that more precise, you cannot do the physical sciences without believing the universe is mathematically intelligible. You've got to be a believer before you start. Christianity is similarly, as every other worldview is, it involves at its foundations faith. And the key question is not whether it involves faith or not, because everything does. It's what is the evidence base for that trust? And of course, the popular myth today is science is evidence-based, so you can trust it and its results. Christianity is, of course, not evidence-based, so you can't trust it. That's absolutely false. The central claim of Christianity, let's lay it down, be clear about it, because there are too many Christians that have bought into this contemporary myth, and they think faith is shutting your eyes and, like Mark Twain said, believing what you know ain't true. That isn't so. And perhaps the most important statement I can make on that comes from the end of John's Gospel. Many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe, that you might have faith, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing, having faith, you might have life in his name. If Christianity was not evidence-based, we would not have the New Testament, because it claims to be evidence, nor would we have the Old Testament. So we got to be clear that as we navigate life and the different worldviews, every single one of them is faith-based. And that's no shame, because the question we need to ask, why should I trust that? And in your life, you do it all the time. You fancy going to a bank and asking for a mortgage, and the bank manager says, what's your collateral? Oh, you just have to trust me. Have you ever tried that? You'll come out with $0. You see, in ordinary life, we know what evidence-based trust is. And it's sometimes misplaced, sadly. So people understand when it's pointed out to them, but the pressure from the other side, from the Dawkins of this world, is that faith is believing where there's no evidence. That's not faith, that's blind faith. And it is very dangerous. And because they don't distinguish, they say crazy things. Like Dawkins, atheists have no faith. And then the rest of his book is about what he believes. I mean, that's just intellectually silly.
So if we take that presupposition that all worldviews have faith of some kind, I think one critique, however, has been the fact that science, however, is reasonable. It's based on facts, and whereas isn't, can you really be a reputable scientist today and a Christian? Because is Christianity really based on, things that we can test with the scientific method, that type of thing? Can you be a scientist and a Christian?
Okay, well, let's unpack that, because there are about 5 questions in there. Can you test it with a scientific method? Now, let's just unpack that. The basic idea behind all of this is rationality. By science, we mean, in the English-speaking world, the natural sciences. Germans have the word Wissenschaft, which means science in the sense of knowledge, as it used to mean. It meant the humanities and the natural sciences. So that we need to be careful when we use the word science, because we can be misunderstood on the continent. I'm using it in terms of the natural sciences. And the basic method is, of course, the employment of reason and logic. And putting it that way, the first important thing to say is that rationality is not coextensive with the natural sciences. If it were, half the faculties in every university in the world would have to shut tomorrow, because history, economics, languages, literature, art, music, and all of those subjects, they're rational, but they're not natural science. And the big lie is, out there in the culture, that only science is rational, so it's coextensive with rationality. We must realize that's nonsense, and we can prove it just as I said. The second thing is, does Christianity then, it's clearly not natural science, but the question is it rational? Is it based on facts? And here I find it absolutely fascinating, the sheer ignorance of our modern society. People don't realize very much or know very much, say, at the very prime level, Did Jesus Christ actually exist? And Bertrand Russell doubted it. Richard Dawkins says in his book that a good case can be made that Jesus never existed, but I wouldn't accept it. I examined where the good case comes from. It comes from a retired professor of German. This is not serious, folks. The people to ask about the existence of Jesus are the ancient historians. So I did ask them and read their writings. Do you know there's scarcely a reputable ancient historian in the world that would doubt not only the existence of Jesus, but most of the central things that he claimed to do, including the appearances at the resurrection? And people tell me, oh, it's all a lot of, there are no facts. There are facts. And if you deny those historical facts, what you're doing is being anti-intellectual, because you are not accepting the authoritative research of brilliant ancient historians, many of whom are not believers in God. That's the interesting thing, and you can read all about them. Secondly, people make crazy statements. What about the authority and authenticity of the Gospels? And just recently, I had an academic said to me, oh, they've been copied out so many times. I hope you've been to the Bible Museum. You'll see documents there of the New Testament that go back to the 3rd and even the 2nd, and very rarely into the 1st centuries. So here we're sitting with a document from the 2nd century, okay? It is 18 centuries old. How many times was it copied out? Maybe once. Maybe not at all. It hasn't been copied thousands of times. That's absurd. We get to the contemporary world in 1 or 2 jumps. And, I mean, I read Latin and some Greek and so on, and you can then go into this in great detail and point out that the documentary evidence for famous people like Tacitus and Herodotus and Josephus is very scant, and often depends on 2 or 3 manuscripts that are written 1,000 years after the events. We've got between 5,500 and 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in part or in whole. It's spectacular. It's the best attested book in the world. And if you want a contemporary take on that, have a look at Peter Williams' new book. It's lovely. He's a brilliant biblical linguist at Cambridge, at Tyndale House. Can we trust the Gospels? So there is a factual base, and then we can start there, and we can move up and investigate things. And you say, can we test these things? And of course, centrally, as a scientist, what people tend to say to me, but come on. Christianity is very supernaturalistic. It claims that God became human. It claims that Jesus rose from the dead. But you can't believe that, because we live in a world where we understand the laws of nature. They didn't. And of course, they were open to all kinds of miracles. You need to know how to answer that. It's very easy to answer, actually. But science doesn't disprove the kind of miracles in the New Testament. I'll say more about that if you like, but if somebody wants more.
No, I would. Here in the United States, we had Thomas Jefferson, who
oh yes,
created his own
short Bible,
in which he removed the miracles, miraculous stories, and things of that nature. And I suppose a question is, we don't necessarily see these kinds of miracles here in America, maybe every day. So how do we explain the miracles? Is that a possibility?
Well. Do you want the short answer, the long answer? We better go for the short answer, I think. Here again, I'm indebted to Lewis. I think Lewis has had for years the best take on this. His book on miracles is brilliant, but a little warning, a health warning. It gets difficult very fast in about chapter 3, and people give up. And that's unfortunate, because after that chapter, it settles down as wonderful. And let's deal with, you see, Joel, where this comes from and why it's so powerful in our society, it goes back to a famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And in your country, you have these wonderful notices, violators will be towed. I don't like those notices. They sound violent almost. And that's violating the law of a country. Now here's the first mistake. That talking about miracles as violations of the laws of nature is a profound mistake. And you see, Hume then said, of course, as I said a moment ago, they didn't know the laws of nature in those days, so it was easy to believe in a miracle. That's nonsense. My reaction to that is, has he never read the New Testament? Joseph knew where babies came from. And when Mary said she was pregnant, did he say, oh, what a marvelous miracle? He didn't. He was a pious, righteous Jew, and the text tells us that he wanted to divorce her. He knew exactly what the law of nature was. And it took a very powerful intervention of God to get him to accept her, which was a very brave thing to do. The man who was born blind in John 9 and got healing, he laughed at the theologians that were, he said, look, from the beginning of the world, it's never been heard that a person born blind got his sight. He knew the norm. And that's why he recognized that what had happened to him was special. Now, here's the irony of all of this. You cannot recognize a miracle unless you know the laws of nature. You've got to know them first. Otherwise, you would never think that God has done a special event. Now, does it break the laws of nature? This is the crucial thing, because if you read Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, he says exactly the same thing. There are no miracles. The laws are complete. There are no violations of them, but all this kind of thing. And that weighs with people, because Hawking was a very, very bright person, but he was no philosopher. Hume actually, although he's influenced mega millions of people, was wrong about this, completely wrong. And his main interpreter for many years was a philosopher called Antony Flew. And he was the Dawkins of his day, and a very strong atheist. But in later life, he came to believe that there was at least some kind of God. And his reason for doing that actually was the nature of the linguistic complexity of DNA. And a year or two before he died, I had an hour and a half talking to him. And I said, what about the miracles argument? And you know, to listen to an elderly, distinguished academic say this was very moving. He said, look, he said, my books on this are wrong. Hume was wrong. I would need to rewrite those books completely, but I'm never going to get the chance. That was very humble. And it's very easy to see why Hume was wrong. I mean, Hume was completely inconsistent, first of all, because he talked about miracles as violations of the law of nature, but his own philosophy forbade him to believe in the law of nature because he didn't believe in cause and effect. That's just a little difficulty in the way. Secondly, Lewis tells this lovely story, and this gets it. I use this all the time to explain to people where the problem lies. I'm staying in a hotel very comfortably here in Washington. So if I put $100 in the drawer by my bed 3 nights ago, and another 100 2 nights ago, so now I've got 1 + 1, $200. And this morning I wake up and put my hand in and I find $50. What do I conclude? Do I conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken? Or the laws of DC? Now think about it. What should I conclude? Which laws have been broken? Yes, DC. And how do I know that? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. Otherwise, I'd say, well, 100 plus 100 is 200 yesterday. Today it's 50. Well, life changes, and we live in a postmodern world, and everything is relative. But this is a very important illustration because it shows where the problem is. It's your knowledge of the laws of arithmetic that tell you that a thief has broken into what you thought was a closed system, the drawer and the room. And here's the problem. The current naturalistic belief is that this universe is a closed system of cause and effect. If there is a God, he's distant, you may forget about him. But he cannot, they use the word intervene, which isn't quite fair. He can't input a new event into the cosmos. But why not? You see, when Jesus made water into wine, if you drank too much, it would make you drunk, according to the laws of nature. Christians are not claiming, let me come to the central miracle of the resurrection. If I was saying that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes going on in the tomb, then it would be breaking the laws of nature. But I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying God raised him from the dead. Immense power was injected from outside an open system. And the basic controversy in our society is our universe a closed system of cause and effect, or is it not? The biblical claim is it's not. The materialistic claim is that it is. And we got to decide between the two. But Lewis's little analogy shows us that we need to distinguish between different kinds of laws. And then the whole thing is clear.
Well, if the world is an open system and there's a God who can intervene, who created this creator? Who created the God?
Do you know, that's interesting, isn't it? This is one of Dawkins' key arguments. And I want to say it's absolutely stupid. And I want to explain to you how to see it's stupid. If I say who or what created, and by the way, you're really right in asking it because it's Dawkins' key argument in the God delusion. Who or what created X? What, by that question, am I assuming about X? That it was created. What if it wasn't? The question doesn't apply. You see, the interesting thing is, this question bypasses the real issue. And the real issue is, could there possibly be, or is there an eternal God? The Bible claims God is eternal, so by definition he wasn't created. So created gods are a delusion. We call them idols. And if Richard had called his book The Created Gods Delusion, we'd have seen through it. You see, it's a non-question. The philosophers call it a complex question. By that they mean it hides an assumption that gives the whole game away. It only applies to created things. So it doesn't deal with the question. It doesn't even approach the question of whether there is an eternal God. But there's more to it than that. Philosophically now, let me look at it as a sort of philosopher. It's really asking, do the questions go back forever? Who created the creator that created the creator that, etc., etc.? But you see, they don't go back forever, either on the atheist side or the Christian side. On the atheist side, ultimate reality, and this is essentially a question about what is the ultimate reality. Do the questions go back forever or do they stop? They stop on both sides. On the atheist side, they stop, well, they used to stop with mass energy, and then they stopped with the Big Bang. And then they stopped with the quantum vacuum. And then they now stop with nothing. And the Christian questions stop with God. The choice presented to our cultured society today is God or nothing. I mean that. This is a claim of leading astrophysicists, including Hawking. And the key statement of his book, The Grand Design, is, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Well, that's nonsense, of course, as you can see just by thinking about it. Because there is a law of gravity, because there's something, the universe will create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction, and I don't find it impressive. So that's what's going on there, I think. And I was amazed to find this as an argument by an Oxford professor. I used to get it from school kids, and I used to get it a lot in Russia, you see. But there's a sting in it, you see. If you watch my first debate with Richard Dawkins down the road in Birmingham, Alabama, he raised this, which just I found flabbergasting. And I said, of course, this question is valid for created things. So let me ask it to you, Richard. You believe the universe created you. Who created your creator? I've waited many years to get an answer to that. And there's none forthcoming. All right? Created gods are a delusion. And Dawkins' argument is not even wrong. It doesn't rise to the dignity of rationality, I'm afraid. But anyway, there we are.
Thank you. Well, as far as the scientific world, and I think people like Richard Dawkins, at least it seems in what I see in the media in the world that most of the scientists I hear about are not followers of Jesus Christ. They're not Christians. Are there any scientists out there who have faith in Jesus Christ?
Oh, yes. And Nobel Prize winners. You see, the myth is that science and God are incompatible. It's enough to demonstrate one Nobel Prize winner in physics to show that that's false, a Christian. William Phillips, to name one in the United States, is precisely that. Because you see, if science and God were incompatible, you would have no scientists in the Academy of Sciences, in the Nobel Prizes, anywhere. But surveys show that about 40% of working scientists believe in a personal God, and that has changed by 1% in 75 years, which is very interesting. The Academy is a bit different, but the reasons people have for believing in God or not believing in God are extremely complex, and you certainly don't decide this by statistics. You decide it by argument, and so on. But the important thing here is to analyze why some of them don't. Because I find the arguments fascinating, particularly with Stephen Hawking, but other people. And what they present to the public is you have to choose between science and God. And that puzzled me. And there are several answers to it, and I've just written a shorter book because some people said they found my book too difficult. So I thought I'd pity them. And I'd write something more accessible. It's called Can Science Explain Everything? And it brings me back to where we were at the start. And it's important to realize that the arguments, the important arguments in this whole debate, are not arguments from results of science. They're arguments about the way science works, the philosophy of science. And the central ones are very simple indeed. Think of the alternative, God or science. Dawkins thinks the God explanation is the same as the science explanation. That is a profound mistake. And I illustrate it by saying, look, the water's boiling. How's that happening? Why does that happen? Well, the scientific explanation runs roughly heat energy from a gas flame is being conducted through the base of the kettle. It's agitating the molecules of water. As their temperature rises, they move faster and faster until it starts to boil. Well, actually, let me tell you, it's boiling because I just love a cup of tea. Now think about that. We're laughing at it. Now, why are we laughing? The reason is we're seeing something. I've given you two explanations of a common event. They're both true. They don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement. Now, if you say science is the only way to truth, you have to eliminate the why question. Dawkins wants to do that. He says it's meaningless to ask a why question of purpose, which is absurd because we all do it. Now, think about that. The issue at stake at the heart of the contemporary debate is teasing out the nature of explanation. What does it mean to explain something? Rational explanation doesn't end at scientific explanation. And in most situations, there are several levels of explanation. So now apply this to the universe and God. And I often say to kids at school who sometimes understand this much better than professors, and it's true. I'm just amazed at academics that can't see this. I say, look, God no more competes with true science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation of a motor car engine. Do you see that? There are different kinds of explanation. One is the scientific one, the other is the personal agency explanation. And most events have got both. I'm thinking of the cup of tea, by the way. People have been drinking cups of tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat equations. So, complementary explanation. God doesn't compete. And that's so important as you look back at the history of science. If God and science were incompatible, we wouldn't have modern science. Because modern science, by and large, is a product of Christianity. Did you know that? Very clearly so, according to historians, with certain nuances. The great scientists, Kepler, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk, Maxwell, Faraday, all believed in God. Newton had quirky beliefs, but he still believed in God. And you see, C.S. Lewis again comes to our rescue by summarizing this. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. You see, it is the biblical worldview that gives you the rational basis for expecting to be able to understand the universe because it was created by an intelligence in whose image you were made. Science, modern science, is a product of Christianity. Far from science and God being incompatible, it was faith in God, an intelligent universe, an intelligible universe, that drove the rise of science. So I'm not embarrassed to be a Christian and a kind of scientist, a mathematician, because arguably it was Christianity gave me my subject. Why should I be ashamed of that? Incidentally, Christianity gave us most of the main universities in the world that teach these subjects. You see, the mistake that people make is that they think, oh, I've got a scientific explanation, therefore I don't need God. That's nonsense. That's like saying, I understand how that turbofan jet works, therefore I don't need design engineers. That's just silly. There are different levels of explanation. Now, children can understand these arguments, which is why I feel it's very important to emphasize to you who are parents, listen to the questions your children ask and equip yourself. If you love your children, you'll not do it if you don't love them. Equip yourselves to answer their questions and spend time on them. You'll find it enormously enriching. Otherwise, we're in danger of breeding a generation of people that all go to faith schools. Let me explain that. I was asked by the BBC some time ago, would I comment on faith schools? And I said, which ones do you mean? Do you mean the secular schools that pump atheism into the students? Or Muslim schools, or Jewish schools, or Christian schools? Every school in our country is a faith school. There's none without a worldview or an ideology. But you see, faith, that's the religious nuts like the Christians. No, it isn't. Worldview permeates our society. And that's why, if I might say, and Joel might not mind me saying it, the work of CSLI is enormously important, because Lewis gave fundamental and unsurpassed insights into all of these questions. That's why I'm sitting here. I'm a product of the C.S. Lewis Institute, you see.
Oh, thank you so much, John.